12-year-old prodigy expelled from school. In the coastal city of Brighton, where the salty air blends with the history of a city rich in culture, a 12-year-old girl walked through the halls of a school that seemed to promise her a bright future. Sarah Bennett, a girl with an overflowing intelligence, was known for her ability to excel in her studies. With her impeccable uniform, backpack full of books, and a determined look, she was heading to the Great Hall of St. George's School. That morning was special. It wasn't just any day. The prestigious National Young Talent Contest was being held, and everyone knew that Sarah was the favorite to win. From an early age, Sarah had shown an amazing ability to solve problems in logic, math, and general knowledge. Her presence in the classroom had earned the admiration and, in some cases, envy of her classmates. As she walked down the hallway, her peers watched her, some with looks of respect and others with silent resentment. Sarah had worked hard to get where she was, but not everyone understood the sacrifices behind her achievements. Emma, her best friend since childhood, intercepted her just before she entered the hall. "Good luck, Brainiac," Emma said with a mischievous smile, trying to ease the tension she knew Sarah was feeling. Sarah returned a nervous smile, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement inside. She was ready, she knew that, but something about the atmosphere unsettled her. Inside the Great Hall, the chatter of participants in the audience filled the space. The tables were lined up in the center, ready for the contestants. Sarah took her assigned seat and took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that threatened to overwhelm her. The school principal, Patrick Hamilton, a man of aristocratic bearing and a stern gaze, approached the central podium with a solemn expression. "Welcome to the 30th National Young Talent Contest," he announced in his deep voice. "May the best one win." His words echoed through the hall, and the contest began. The tension in the room was palpable as the participants faced the most challenging tasks in logic, math, and general knowledge. Sarah shone in every test, standing out for the speed and accuracy of her answers. With each challenge overcome, the audience held their breath, knowing that the title was within Sarah's grasp. However, just before the final test, something unexpected happened. Principal Hamilton interrupted the contest. His face, usually neutral, now reflected a mixture of disappointment and contained fury. "I regret to inform you," he said in a tone that chilled everyone's blood, "that we have discovered a case of cheating." Murmurs spread through the hall like an uncontrollable wave. Sarah, surprised, looked around, not understanding what was happening. "Sarah Bennett," Hamilton said harshly, "is disqualified and expelled from St. George's School." The principal's words echoed in her head like a death sentence. In that instant, Sarah's world collapsed. The accusatory looks of her classmates, the whispers, the shocked expressions. Everything swirled in a tornado of confusion and pain. "But I didn't cheat," she cried desperately as tears began to run down her cheeks. Her protests were ignored, however. Two school staff members escorted her out of the hall, while Sarah, devastated, looked at her parents from a distance. They, humble workers who had made enormous sacrifices to give their daughter this opportunity, watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and shame. That night, Sarah cried herself to sleep in her small apartment in Hove. Her once promising, dream-filled future had crumbled in an instant, and though the pain was unbearable, something inside her awakened, a spark of determination. This would not be the end of her story. One day, she would return and uncover the truth. If you enjoyed this first chapter, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. The best is yet to come. 20 years after that fateful expulsion, life had completely changed for Sarah Bennett. Now, a 32-year-old woman, Sarah had managed to rebuild her life with impressive success. Having become a renowned lawyer, she was known for her professional ethics and her ability to tackle the most complicated cases with a precision and tenacity that left her colleagues in awe. On a sunny Brighton morning, Sarah walked confidently toward the building of the law firm where she worked. She wore an impeccable suit, and her hair, now shorter, softly framed her face. Though her professional achievements were evident, the past still weighed heavily inside her, hidden beneath the surface of her apparent success. She had not forgotten the day her life had changed forever. The humiliation, the injustice, the pain of being falsely accused. All of it was still alive in her memory, like a scar that never fully healed. She had promised herself that one day she would return to St. George, not as a humiliated girl, but as a woman with the power to confront the ghosts of her past. Fate, however, seemed to have its own plans. She had just arrived at her office when her assistant, Marta, rushed in with an urgent expression. "Sarah, you have an urgent call," Marta said, clearly concerned. "It's from St. George's School." Sarah's heart stopped for a moment. The name of the school that had marked her childhood still held an indescribable power over her. For 20 years, she had avoided any contact with St. George, refusing to allow that place to define her. But now, something had changed. "Put it through," she said firmly, hiding the storm of emotions stirring inside her. "This is Sarah Bennett," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "Miss Bennett, I'm James Miller, the current principal of St. George's School," said a voice on the other end of the line. "We are facing a critical situation and urgently need your help." Sarah's heart began to race. "What's going on?" she asked, unable to hide the curiosity that was growing inside her. "The school is being sued," Miller replied in a worried tone, "and if we lose, we'll have to close." Sarah listened in silence, trying to process what she had just heard. St. George's School about to close? The irony did not escape her. The place that had once rejected her now needed her help. "Why are you calling me, Mr. Miller?" Sarah asked, keeping her calm. "Surely you know my history with the school." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Precisely because of that," Miller said. "We know that your reputation as a lawyer is impeccable. No one understands the importance of this case better, and maybe it's time to correct old wrongs." Sarah felt a chill down her spine. The opportunity she had waited for over 2 decades was right in front of her. She could refuse. She could let the school that humiliated her sink. But the spark of determination that had ignited inside her 20 years ago now burned brighter than ever. "Very well, Mr. Miller," she said calmly. "I'll take the case. I'll be at the school first thing tomorrow morning to discuss the details." When she hung up the phone, Sarah stood in silence for a moment, staring out the window of her office. Brighton was still the city she knew so well, but something in the air felt different. The time had come to face the past. The next day, the sun was just rising over Brighton when Sarah parked her car in front of the imposing St. George's School building. 20 years had passed since she had last crossed those doors, but the memory of the place was as fresh in her mind as if it had been yesterday. The school's tall columns, well-kept gardens, and stone facades still stood as witnesses to the past she had tried so hard to forget. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swelling inside her. She felt like that 12-year-old girl again, nervous and insecure, but she was no longer a child. She had grown, she had fought, and she had become strong and respected. Even so, the weight of the past made her hesitate for a moment. "Come on, Sarah, you're not a kid anymore," she told herself, straightening her shoulders and walking confidently toward the entrance. The interior of the school hadn't changed much since the last time she had set foot in it. The same hallways, the same decorated tiles on the walls, and that scent of old books still lingered in the air. Sarah walked toward the secretary's office, where a middle-aged woman greeted her with a smile. "Good morning, I'm Sarah Bennett. I have an appointment with Principal Miller," she announced calmly. The secretary looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. She probably knew her story, though she said nothing. "Of course, Miss Bennett. The principal is expecting you. Follow me, please." Sarah followed her down the hallways, noticing the stares from some teachers and students. The murmurs followed her like a distant echo. It wasn't surprising. After all, how could they forget the prodigy girl who was expelled for cheating? Even after 2 decades, it seemed that the school had not forgotten her story. When they reached the principal's office, the secretary gently knocked on the door. "Come in," a voice said from the other side. Sarah walked in and came face to face with James Miller, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a worried expression. He stood up from his desk and extended his hand. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming," Miller said sincerely. "Please, have a seat." Sarah sat down in front of the desk, carefully observing the office. On the wall hung a framed photograph of the faculty from years ago. Among them, she recognized the former principal, Patrick Hamilton, the man who had been responsible for her expulsion. "I see you've noticed the photograph," Miller said, following her gaze. "Patrick Hamilton retired a few years ago. He was the one who recommended me for the position." Sarah nodded, storing that information for later. She knew that at some point she would have to talk about Hamilton, but for now, her focus was on the lawsuit. "Mr. Miller, let's talk about the case," Sarah said, crossing her legs with a professional demeanor. "What exactly is threatening the school?" Miller sighed deeply, as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. "It's a class action lawsuit, Ms. Bennett. A group of former students is alleging that the school covered up cases of bullying for years. If they win, the damages will be enormous, and the school won't be able to handle it. We'll have to close." Sarah frowned, processing the information. "And do they have proof of these alleged cover-ups?" she asked, trying to analyze the situation from all angles. "That's the most troubling part," Miller replied, lowering his voice. "It seems someone provided them with internal documents that, according to our records, were destroyed years ago." Sarah felt something click in her mind. Could there be a connection between those documents and her own expulsion? She decided not to reveal her suspicions, at least not yet. "I'll need access to all the school's records, Mr. Miller," Sarah said with determination, "and I want to talk to all the teachers who were here 20 years ago." Miller nodded, though Sarah could sense some doubt in his eyes. "Of course, you'll have everything you need. But Ms. Bennett, I have to ask, are you sure you can handle this case objectively, given your history with the school?" Sarah stood up and looked him straight in the eyes. "My past with this school is precisely what makes me the right person for this case. I know its hallways, its secrets, and above all, I know what it's like to have your dreams taken away here. I will defend St. George with everything I have, but if I uncover anything shady, I won't hesitate to expose it." Miller paled slightly but nodded with respect. "Understood, Miss Bennett. I trust your professionalism." When Sarah left the office, she paused for a moment in the hallway. The echo of her footsteps resonated in the silence, like a reminder of the ghosts of the past that still followed her. But she was no longer the girl she once was. Now she had the power to unearth old secrets and seek justice. In the days that followed, Sarah immersed herself in the investigation of the case at hand. They had assigned her a small office within the school, a modest space overlooking the gardens. There, she spent hours reviewing old records, files, and disciplinary logs that, for the most part, seemed harmless. But Sarah knew that the answers she sought were there, buried among pages of data that, at first glance, didn't reveal much. The smell of old paper and the dust accumulated in the files constantly reminded her how much time had passed since her expulsion. With every page she turned, her conviction grew stronger that there was a connection between her unjust expulsion and the current crisis the school was facing. One afternoon, while she was reviewing some documents, she heard a soft knock at the door. When she looked up, she saw a woman in her 60s timidly peeking through the door. She had gray hair tied up in a bun and a kind look in her eyes. "Sarah, I'm Alice Turner. I don't know if you remember me. I was your literature teacher," said the woman with a warm smile. Sarah immediately stood up, surprised to see one of the few people she had trusted during her time at the school. "Miss Turner," Sarah exclaimed, "of course I remember you. You always believed in me." Alice smiled and entered the office, closing the door behind her. "Sarah, when I heard you were here, I knew I had to talk to you. There are things you should know about what happened 20 years ago." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. For years, she had been trying to find answers, and perhaps Alice Turner could provide them. "What do you mean, Miss Turner?" Sarah asked, motioning for her to sit down. Alice sat with her hands clasped in her lap, looking at Sarah with a mixture of sadness and determination. "The day you were expelled, I was in the teacher's lounge," she began. "I overheard a conversation between Principal Patrick Hamilton and another teacher, William Stevens. They were talking about you. They said they had to take care of the problem you represented." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you saying my expulsion was planned?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alice nodded, her face filled with deep sadness. "I always knew something wasn't right. You were a brilliant student, incapable of cheating. But at that time, the school was going through financial difficulties, and I was the scholarship student," Sarah finished, beginning to understand what was going on. "Exactly. Hamilton saw in you an opportunity to save money while pleasing some influential families whose children were competing with you," Alice explained. "But there's more, Sarah. A few years ago, before he retired, I saw William Stevens taking documents out of the archive. He seemed nervous, like he was doing something improper." Sarah's mind was racing, processing all the information. Could those documents Stevens removed be related to her expulsion? "Miss Turner, do you know where I can find William Stevens now?" Sarah asked, her tone filled with determination. Alice nodded slowly. "He retired a couple of years ago. He lives in Kemptown, where he opened a small bookstore. I'll give you his address." Now, she took a piece of paper from her bag and handed it to Sarah. As she did, she looked at her with concern. "Be careful, Sarah. If my suspicions are correct, there are very powerful people involved in this." Sarah took the paper and nodded, grateful. "Thank you, Miss Turner. This helps me more than you know." When Alice left the office, Sarah stared out the window, watching the courtyard where she had once played and dreamed of a bright future. She knew the path to uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy, but she was more determined than ever. Now it wasn't just a matter of personal justice. It was about exposing a system that had been rotten for decades. That same night, Sarah decided not to wait any longer. She grabbed her car keys and headed to Kemptown, the neighborhood where, according to Alice Turner, William Stevens had opened his bookstore after retiring. As she drove through the narrow cobbled streets of Brighton, her mind kept replaying everything she had learned. If what Alice had said was true, her expulsion hadn't been a last-minute decision, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver to get rid of her. And if Stevens had been involved, then he likely had more information than he had revealed so far. When she arrived at the small bookstore in Kemptown, Sarah parked the car and observed the place from a distance. The interior lights were on, and through the shop window, she could see the figure of an older man arranging some books. The sign on the door indicated that the store was closed, but that didn't stop Sarah. She took a deep breath and approached the door, knocking firmly. The man, who was clearly William Stevens, slowly approached the door. At first, he squinted to see who it was, but when he recognized Sarah's face, his expression changed completely. It was as if he had seen a ghost. With trembling hands, Stevens opened the door. "Sarah Bennett," he murmured, a mixture of surprise and concern in his voice. "I suppose this day had to come." "I think you and I have a lot to talk about, Mr. Stevens," Sarah said bluntly, her voice filled with determination. Stevens nodded, resigned, and invited her into the bookstore's back room. The place was cluttered with books and papers, giving it a disorganized feel, but Sarah wasn't distracted by the surroundings. She had come here to get answers, and she wouldn't leave without them. They both sat down, and for a moment, the silence between them was overwhelming. Sarah watched him closely, noticing the weariness in his face and the worry lines on his forehead. "Mr. Stevens," Sarah began, not wasting time, "I need you to tell me the truth about what happened the day I was expelled. I know there's more to this, and you know it too." Stevens sighed deeply, as if the weight of the years were pressing down on him. "Sarah, I never thought I'd have to face this," he began, running a hand through his graying hair. "But I suppose the past always catches up with us, doesn't it?" Sarah watched him patiently, waiting for him to continue. "It all started a few months before the contest," Stevens continued. "The school was going through a delicate financial situation. Patrick Hamilton was desperate to secure financial support from some powerful families, and you, Sarah, were a threat to the system he had built." "A threat?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "Yes, a threat," Stevens said, looking her in the eye. You see, for years, the school had favored the children of the wealthiest and most influential families. Their grades were inflated. They were given undeserved awards. But you, with your natural intelligence and work ethic, were exposing all of them. You were too good for them to compete with you fairly. Sarah's heart raced as she listened. Everything was starting to make sense. So my expulsion was a calculated decision? She asked, already knowing the answer. Stevens nodded, his face full of guilt. Exactly. Patrick Hamilton saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. Eliminate the threat you posed and secure the financial support of the families who wanted their children to succeed at any cost. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. But how could they accuse me of cheating without proof? She asked, her voice filled with indignation. Stevens lowered his gaze, visibly ashamed. I was the one who planted the evidence, he admitted. Hamilton pressured me. He threatened to expose some mistakes from my past if I didn't do it. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. All the pain, confusion, and humiliation she had felt for years crystallized in that moment. And the documents, Sarah began, returning to Alice Turner's words. Those you took from the archive. What do they have to do with all this? Stevens nodded slowly as if resigned to tell her everything. A few years ago, I started feeling tremendous guilt for what I had done. I knew I had contributed to something terrible. So I began collecting documents, copies of records that proved how the system had been manipulated. Not just with you, but with other students over the years. With difficulty, Stevens got up from his chair and walked over to a bookshelf filled with dusty books. He moved some of them and pulled out a thick folder filled with yellowed papers. Here's everything, Sarah. The proof of the corruption at St. George's, including your unjust expulsion. Sarah took the folder with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the truth in every page. She had spent so long searching for answers, and now she had them in her hands. But with them came a new responsibility. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, not taking her eyes off the papers. Because when I heard you were back, I knew it was time to face the truth. I'm willing to testify, Sarah. It's the least I can do to make up for my mistakes. Sarah sat in silence, processing what she had just heard. Her lawyer's mind was already drawing up a plan, but her heart was still struggling with the overwhelming emotions. This changes everything, she finally said. Not just my personal case, but the entire system at the school. Stevens nodded. I know, and I'm ready to face the consequences. As Sarah left the bookstore with the folder firmly in her hands, she felt something lift from her shoulders. The truth, so long sought after, was finally in her grasp. But now the question was, what would she do with it? When Sarah returned to her apartment that night, the lights of Brighton shimmered in the distance, reflecting off the calm sea that surrounded the city. Inside, her mind was still racing. The documents she had obtained from William Stevens held the key to dismantling the entire corrupt system that had affected so many students, including herself. But with that truth came great responsibility. Sitting at the table in her small but cozy Brighton apartment, Sarah spread the documents out in front of her. The folder she had received from William Stevens was packed with evidence, manipulated disciplinary records, inflated grades, and illegal agreements between former principal Patrick Hamilton and several influential families. There was more than Sarah had imagined, and as she read, the magnitude of the corruption at St. George's overwhelmed her. Among the documents, Sarah found minutes from private meetings in which Hamilton discussed how to cover up cases of bullying and abuse within the school. The system she had once considered untouchable had not only betrayed her, but dozens of other students who never had the chance to defend themselves. Her lawyer's mind was already mapping out a plan to expose all this information. She knew this wasn't just about clearing her own name. There were many others who had been affected and deserved justice. The question was she ready to face the consequences of exposing everything? As she reviewed the documents, her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Emma, her former friend from school, who now worked as a teacher at St. George's. The message was short and direct. Sarah, I heard you're investigating the case. Please be careful. There are people who don't want this to come to light. Sarah frowned as she read the message. Although Emma had always been a close friend, their paths had diverged after the expulsion. They had exchanged a few messages over the years, but contact had been minimal. Knowing that Emma was worried about what Sarah might uncover only added more weight to the situation. She stood up and walked to the window. From there, she could see the twinkling lights of Brighton in the distance. As she looked at the horizon, she thought about all the students who had passed through the school, trusting that St. George's would offer them a fair and honest education. She knew she couldn't turn back. How could something so rotten stay hidden for so long, she wondered. And even more unsettling, how many people within the school knew what was happening and chose to remain silent? That night, Sarah barely slept. The pages of the report continued to stretch before her closed eyes, and Emma's words echoed in her mind. The next morning, Sarah woke up early with the first rays of sunlight streaming through the windows of her apartment. She knew it was time to act. With Stevens' documents at her disposal, her next step would be to confront James Miller, the current principal, and make sure he was also aware of the depth of the corruption. When she arrived at St. George's, Sarah felt the weight of the atmosphere. The teachers and students who saw her pass by watched her with looks full of curiosity, even uncertainty. The news that Sarah Bennett, the expelled alumna, was investigating the case had begun to spread through the school's halls. When she reached the principal's office, James Miller greeted her with a worried expression. "Sarah, thank you for coming so quickly," Miller said, inviting her to sit down in his office. "It wasn't hard to decide," Sarah replied, placing the folder of documents on the table in front of him. "We need to talk about this." Miller frowned and opened the folder. As his eyes scanned the pages, his expression of concern turned into a mixture of shock and resignation. It was as if he was seeing for the first time the evidence of the corruption that had been eating away at the school for decades. "This is worse than I imagined," Miller murmured, slowly closing the folder. "I knew there had been some problems in the past, but I never suspected it was this serious." "The problem isn't just the corruption, Mr. Miller," Sarah replied. "It's the systematic cover-up. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a system designed to protect the powerful and punish those who don't fit their mold." Miller looked at her, speechless at first, but then nodded gravely. "You're right," he said in a softer tone. "What you've uncovered must come to light. The problem is, if this goes public, the school won't survive. The wealthy, influential families involved will do everything they can to protect their interests." Sarah understood the implications, but she couldn't afford to back down now. "Mr. Miller, this isn't just about St. George's. It's about all the lives that have been affected by this system. I can't allow things to continue as they are. We need transparency, and the school must take responsibility," Sarah said firmly. Miller nodded again, this time with more conviction. "You're right. What's the next step?" "We need to release this information strategically," Sarah replied. "If we reveal everything at once, the people involved in the corruption will try to destroy us before we have the chance to act. We have to make sure the evidence reaches the press, but also the authorities, and we can't do it alone." Miller and Matthew exchanged a look, understanding the gravity of what was coming. They knew they were about to face powerful enemies. That afternoon, as Sarah returned to her apartment, her phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from Isabel. "Be careful. They're starting to ask questions about you." The message was vague, but Sarah understood its meaning. The people they were exposing were starting to take notice of their moves. She knew Isabel was taking a considerable risk by helping her, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. That night, as she reviewed the documents once again, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. She was getting closer to the truth, but also more exposed than ever. With Isabel's help and her contacts in the media, Sarah and her team decided to make a controlled leak of the information. The goal was to draw public attention without revealing all the details at once. The journalist handling the investigation was someone they trusted, known for his ethics and ability to uncover large-scale corruption cases. The first article was published under the headline, "Corruption at St. George's. Former students accuse the school of academic manipulation and unjust expulsions." The article detailed some of the stories of former students like Matthew, Claire, and others who had been expelled under suspicious circumstances. While no specific names of the perpetrators were mentioned, the article hinted that the corruption at St. George's had been going on for decades, affecting hundreds of students. The impact was immediate. Local media began echoing the news, and soon it became a topic of conversation throughout the city of Brighton. Parents of current students demanded answers, and social media was flooded with comments and speculation about what had really happened at St. George's. However, along with the media attention came the first reprisals. Sarah began receiving anonymous emails filled with threats. Some were vague while others were explicit. If she didn't stop investigating, she and everyone supporting her would pay the price. Although Sarah had expected some kind of reaction, the intensity of the threats caught her off guard. She knew the people behind St. George's wouldn't stop at anything to protect their secrets. The following days were a whirlwind of chaos. The news about the corruption at St. George's kept appearing in the media, and more former students felt motivated to speak out. However, the threats against Sarah and her team also intensified. One afternoon, as Sarah returned to her apartment, she noticed something strange as she approached the door. At first, she couldn't pinpoint what it was, but when she got closer, she saw that the door had been forced. Her heart sank. She entered cautiously, seeing that everything in her apartment was ransacked. Papers, books, and personal belongings were scattered across the floor. Someone had gone through the place. The first thing she thought of was Stevens's documents. She rushed to her desk, where she had carefully stored them, but when she opened the drawer, she realized the folder was gone. She stood frozen for a few seconds. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. She immediately called the police, but as she waited, she knew this was a warning. Those behind the corruption at St. George's didn't just want to stop her. They were willing to destroy her. When the officers arrived, Sarah explained the situation. They took notes and assured her they would investigate. But Sarah knew this wasn't just a robbery. It was a clear message. If she kept going, things would only get worse. Despite the attack on her home, Sarah refused to be intimidated. She knew they were trying to scare her, but she also knew that if she gave up now, everything she had fought for would crumble. She decided to stand firm and called an urgent meeting with Matthew, Isabel, and James Miller. "They've stolen Stephen's documents," Sarah announced as soon as everyone was present. "They're playing dirty." Miller and Matthew looked at her with concern, while Isabel crossed her arms, clearly angry. "We knew they wouldn't stop," Isabel said, "but we can't let this stop us. If they've stolen the documents, It's because they're afraid of what we could do with them. We need to take the next step, Matthew added. We can't wait for them to decide our next move. Sarah nodded. Although that they had lost the original documents, they knew what they contained, and they still had the testimonies of the former students who had decided to speak out. They decided to contact the trusted journalist again and make a second, more explosive leak. The next article was much more damning. It detailed not only the academic manipulation, but also the corrupt financial ties between Patrick Hamilton and several influential families in Brighton. While the names still weren't revealed, the article hinted that it involved high-profile people in the city. The publication caused a storm. Local authorities were forced to issue statements, and Brighton's police announced they would open a formal investigation into the matter. For the first time in decades, St. George's found itself at the center of a public scandal. The tension in Brighton reached its peak. The media were in a frenzy, and the families involved in the corruption began pulling strings to try and control the damage. However, Sarah and her team were determined not to let it all come down to another cover-up. One morning, Sarah received a call from James Miller. His voice sounded grave. "Sarah, you need to come to the school immediately. Something big is about to happen." When she arrived at St. George's, Miller led her straight to his office. Inside, waiting for her, was a group of men in suits whom Sarah recognized immediately. They were lawyers, representatives of the most powerful families in Brighton. One of them, an older man with carefully combed gray hair, stood up to speak. "Ms. Bennett," he began in a diplomatic tone, "we are here to reach an agreement. We know you are in possession of delicate information regarding what occurred at this school. We are willing to offer you significant compensation if you agree to stop your investigation and withdraw the charges." Sarah looked at them with disdain. She knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to buy her silence, as they had done with so many others over the years. "I'm not interested in your money," Sarah replied coldly. "I'm interested in the truth." The man smiled slightly, but his eyes were cold. "Think carefully, Ms. Bennett. What we are offering is an opportunity to avoid a war you cannot win." Sarah held her gaze firmly. "I'm already in this war, and I'm not going to surrender." The lawyers exchanged glances before standing up. "Then so be it," the older man said before leaving. As they walked out of the office, Sarah felt more determined than ever. She knew it wouldn't be easy and that the days ahead would be filled with challenges, but she wouldn't let those men intimidate her. When the lawyers were gone, Miller approached her. "It wasn't easy for me to bring them here, but I knew you had to see how far they're willing to go." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, James. I know." She knew the worst was yet to come, but she also knew she wasn't alone in this fight. In the end, the truth came out. The corrupt system at St. George's was dismantled, and many of those responsible faced legal consequences. Sarah achieved what she had set out to do, not only to clear her name, but also to dismantle a network of corruption that had affected so many people. St. George's School, though wounded, survived. Deep reforms were implemented, and under the leadership of people committed to transparency, the school began a process of recovery. As for Sarah, she had become a symbol of justice, not only for the former students of St. George's, but for the entire city of Brighton. The fight had been arduous, but in the end, the truth prevailed. Thank you for following this thrilling story full of twists and turns. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and leave your comment. See you in the next story.
Alright, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me and began to speak. "There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only." Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. "I'm leaving." After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick? Is something wrong?" Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my second year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, I'm thirsty. Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. I don't care what they say, I plan to quit any time, he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance. As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them. It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. "All right, everyone's presentations are done." "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me. "There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer." He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. "Still here?" Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. "I'm leaving." I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick! What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. "Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized." Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. "All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason." "What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do." "I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you." "Please." Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, "Yes. That's Nick for you." Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, "I'm very sorry." Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, "Get his boss here immediately." It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. "What is that idiot doing?" "All right, Adam, you're coming with me." If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I obediently followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was, as the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. "Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize." Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. "What kind of training are you giving your subordinates?" Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed, I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry." Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, "I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong." "Mike, what have you done?" Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that? Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here. He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part." I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you've failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.